I've been asked to talk about is research, innovation, and clinical practice, and I really want to talk about research. Because with research, hopefully, comes innovation. Now, primary research is divided into two groups. There's primary research, as here, with experimental medicine, studies looking at the effectiveness of interventions, either the clinical effectiveness or cost effectiveness or both, and then there's epidemiology. And then we have secondary research synthesizing, bringing together by systematic reviewing, meta-analyses, guideline development, the body of knowledge that Muir has talked about so eloquently. What so often in the sort of research we're interested in at NICE is comparative research, and we often look at it in terms of an effectiveness plane. Along the horizontal axis here, we're looking to see if the new treatment is less effective or more effective. But we're also interested to see whether the new treatment is less expensive or more expensive. Now, treatments coming here, where they are less effective, more expensive, we don't want them. Treatments coming here, where they're more effective and less expensive, my God, we want them. And actually they are there. They are there. We just don't use them often enough. There are things here that are less effective but less expensive. That's a problem, fortunately. We don't have many of those at NICE. The problem we have often at NICE is things are more expensive but are more effective. And it's really a question of whether the increase in the effectiveness warrants the increase in the expenditure. And it is critically important, what we do at NICE is looking at comparative effectiveness. Does treatment A work better than treatment B? Now, there are various ways in which you can do this comparative effectiveness. The simplest way is direct comparison. You compare treatment A versus treatment B. That's relatively straightforward, and when you've got it, it's very useful. But most of the time, we don't have that. We don't have these comparative studies. And we have to infer these comparative effectiveness by so-called indirect comparisons, so which the simplest is you look at A versus placebo, B versus placebo, and then you can impute A versus B. It actually works remarkably well most of the time, provided you do it sensibly and intelligently. A more complicated is where you actually combine in a model both direct comparisons and indirect comparisons, and it's known as direct treatment comparisons. Now, as I already said, direct comparisons of A versus B are very helpful, and the conventional approach to doing this is by the randomized controlled trial. And you know just as well as I do what this involves. It involves comparing, dividing patients into two similar groups, treatment A, treatment B, and looking at the difference in the outcomes at the end of the study. And we have this religious addiction to a p-value 0.05. And randomized controlled trials do unquestionably have great strengths. They minimize bias. The fact that it's random allocation is very important because it means there is no bias, or minimal bias, in the allocation of treatments. It minimizes confounding, and it minimizes, provided the study has been done properly, what the statisticians call random error, but you and I might call chance. And randomized controlled trials have been very important. And what I'm going to say now doesn't undermine the benefits, but they do have some thumping disadvantages. They're based on the null hypothesis. That is to say, you start off the analysis by assuming there's no difference between the two treatments. It's a bloody balmy way of actually thinking about things, because most of the time, you're not interested in the null hypothesis. We have this wretched thing called the p-value. I can wax lyrical for hours about the limitations of p-values. It is often uncertain as to whether or not the results of a randomized controlled trial in a select group of people will work with the same answer when given to the multiplicity of patients. And randomized controlled trials are becoming outrageously expensive. There are randomized controlled trials that are going on at the moment that are costing $500 million to do. We cannot sustain this. There are, of course, other ways in which we could look at comparative efficacy. And here are these observational design studies, and I just want to take one, just by way of example, historical control trials. And by example, I want just to show you about port wine stains. Port wine stains are these red marks on the skin that you have at birth and you stay with you throughout life. Probably the most important, memorable port wine stain belongs to Mikhail Gorbachev. It's sort of his barcode, really. Now, it's possible nowadays to remove these with very simple laser therapy. And they go. And this is what Mr. Gorbachev would look like if he had his port wine stain. I'm sure he doesn't want it. As I said, it's his barcode, and it just looks like a middle-aged, slightly portly Russian on the right, but on the left is obviously distinguishable. The point is, you don't need a randomized control trial. If he doesn't have the laser therapy, it stays with him for the rest of his life. 3 months after laser therapy, it's gone away. So we need to get away from the idea that everything has to be done by randomized control trials. It doesn't. And there are other ways of looking at comparative efficacy. Now, the research environment in Britain is very much based on the National Health Service. Experimental medicine largely carried out in National Health Service. Clinical trials in the NHS, either in hospitals or by general practitioners. And much of epidemiology is also carried out in the NHS, but also in the general population. And the research and governance arrangements in Britain really involves 3 components. There is clinical trials authorization if you're doing a medicine, which is governed by the European Clinical Trials Directive, God help us. There's ethics approval, and there's NHS governance approval at trust level. Now, about 18 months ago, the Academy of Medical Sciences was asked by the government to look into the environment for regulation and governance of research, and I was asked to chair the working group. And we looked carefully at these 3 components. Clinical trials directive covers first-in-man studies, clinical trials of new active substances, clinical trials for new indications. But it also includes all sorts of things that it really shouldn't. And the problem is that it doesn't just require these authorization, but you have to get ethics approval, not unreasonably. You have to get GMP certification, good manufacturing practice. You have to conform with good clinical practice. You have to have monitoring by GCP inspectors, and you have to organize an indemnity. And the ridiculousness of some of this goes into the terrible story we heard about in the working group of a group of oncologists who wanted to find out whether high-dose morphine in patients with advanced cancer produced cognitive impairment. Perfectly reasonable question. Are they capable of making a will? They wanted to do this, but they had told they had to get clinical trials authorization, which involved ethics approval. Okay. They had to demonstrate that the morphine had a good manufacturing certificate. This is morphine that you get off the shelf in the chemists. They had to store it at plus 4 degrees centigrade, because all investigational products have to be stored at plus 4 degrees centigrade. They had to have a temperature monitor in the fridge to make sure that it didn't rise to room temperature. Of course, we always keep morphine at room temperature. And the fridge had a special locks on because of, and so on and so forth. When they were told they then had to pay a indemnity of £4,000, they gave up and did something else. Now, a more ridiculous situation we've got ourselves into. So that's the clinical trials problem. The ethical approval, there is a generic ethics approval by the National Research Ethics Service, and most of the people who responded, and we had hundreds and hundreds of people responding to our call for evidence, agreed that it was working pretty well. But the problem is there's a whole lot of other ethics approvals that are often needed, and these tend to run in parallel, in series rather than in parallel, and it can take you months to get through these various bodies. And then worse still is the NHS research governance arrangements. There are global checks and there are local checks. The problem is the global checks are done by everybody as well as the local checks. So I met an investigator who'd had 60 CRB checks for one study because each of 60 trusts insisted on doing their own checks. I mean, you can't get anything more absurd. So we came up with some recommendations for four broad groups: overarching principles, trials authorization, ethics review, and research governance. The overarching principles, we felt it is important to safeguard the well-being of participants in clinical research. But the principles should facilitate high-quality research for the public benefit. The regulatory environment should be proportionate, efficient, and coordinated. And we should ensure that we build and maintain confidence of the public in the value of health research. So when it comes to clinical trials authorization, in the short term, it needs to be proportionate, consistent, and rebuild professional confidence, but in the long term, there needs to be a fundamental revision of the European Clinical Trials Directive. And I'm glad to say that Brussels is, as ever, of course, at a snail's pace, but is actually moving in that direction. When it comes to ethical review and approval, there needs to be a single ethics review, building on the success of the National Research Ethics Service. And when it comes to research governance, study-wide global check should be done once. One CRB check. You don't need to do it 60 times. And local checks, and there are necessary local checks, making sure that there's enough patients, that the investigator has enough time, that the pharmacist can store the drugs and so on, they should be done in 20 days. We also wanted to change the culture in the NHS so that the trusts, the NHS generally, trust boards, managers and so on, accept the responsibility for future patients, and also to explain to the public how important research is for the future. To make this happen, we propose that we should create, or the government should create, a health research agency. All health research applications should go to the Health Research Agency. It would arrange for National Research Ethics Service, and it would do the global checks on behalf of individual trusts. The clinical trials authorization we actually felt should remain with the NHRA, who is the body currently doing it. And we said this needs to happen as soon as possible. And I'm glad to say, for once in my life, the government have accepted a bit of advice and have actually already laid the statutory instruments which will create the Health Research Agency as of the 1st of December. And I hope it makes a huge difference. So, clinical research underpins innovation and improves healthcare. The UK and the NHS have a proud history of clinical research, but the current regulatory and government arrangements are damaging. But hopefully, the new Health Research Agency will change all that. But fourthly, clinical research is everyone's business. Government and the Department of Health, NHS managers, NHS clinicians. And your most famous son here at Wigan, the man who has brought relief to millions of sufferers from osteoarthritis as a hip, he worked in the NHS, made pioneering achievements, no randomized controlled trial, for which there are, as I said, millions of people that benefit. Thank you very much indeed.